Forget the romantic myths of great English navigators. Forget the valiant heroes whose names are etched in gold on the pages of history. Today, we peel back the layers on a figure who is perhaps the greatest paradox of the Elizabethan era, Sir Martin Frobisher. A man who stood shoulder to shoulder with Drake, battled the Spanish Armada, yet pulled off a scam so audacious it could have crippled England's entire economy. Let me shock you. Martin Frobisher was no hero. He was a brilliant con artist who sold Queen Elizabeth I's rocks, ordinary worthless stones, which he passed off as tons of pure gold, extracting a fortune from the treasury equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars. Imagine the scale of this deception. An entire fleet, dozens of expeditions, thousands of lives, colossal resources, all for a mythical El Dorado that existed only in his flawlessly deceptive imagination. This isn't just a fact, it's a daring assertion that rewrites history textbooks. How? Could a man who defrauded the most powerful woman of his time out of untold riches then transform into a national hero? It's a deep dive into the psychology of a man who learned to manipulate reality, whose audacity knew no bounds, and whose life was a continuous chain of challenges to society and himself. He didn't merely seek gold, he created illusions that became reality for an entire nation. But where did this fervent need for risk, this ruthless grip, this masterful ability to deceive come from? What forged this pirate mystifier who managed to convince an entire court that ordinary cobblestones were the future of the British Empire? We've already witnessed the grand spectacle, the dazzling illusion of Sir Martin Frobisher, a man who sold a nation the dream of gold, transforming ordinary stones into a royal fortune. But what shaped this audacious architect of deception? What deep currents churned beneath the polished surface of a national hero? To truly grasp the colossal scale of his lies, we must plunge into the crucible of his early years, into the raw, unvarnished truth of a childhood that didn't just shape him, but broke him, then rebuilt him into something monstrously brilliant. Imagine the biting winds of Yorkshire, not merely a geographical location, but a metaphor for the harsh realities that greeted young Martin. He wasn't born into destitution, no. His family, the Frobishers, were minor gentry, their lineage a faded tapestry of past glories, now frayed at the edges. This wasn't the kind of poverty that starves the body, but the kind that gnaws at the soul, a poverty of status, of unrealized potential. The constant, smoldering humiliation of seeing those of lesser birth ascend, while his own family clung to the lower rungs of a brutally stratified society. Picture a boy, 10 or 12, witnessing his father or an elder relative subjected to public insult, financial ruin, the sneers of a debt collector. This gnawing shame, this intuitive grasp that the world, for all its pomp and ceremony, was fundamentally unjust. It wasn't about merit, it was about birthright, connections, and most crucially, wealth. This wasn't merely an observation, it was a wound. A festering wound of perceived injustice that would never truly heal. It was here, in the shadow of dwindling gentry, that the seed of radical ambition began to sprout, twisted by resentment. Perhaps it was a trivial incident, magnified by the raw nerves of youth. A first naive infatuation betrayed by a wealthier rival. A moment of academic brilliance dismissed by a condescending tutor. Or, more likely, the crushing weight of expectation combined with the harsh reality of diminishing family fortunes, pushing him towards a desperate resolution. There's a psychological tipping point, a point of no return, when the conventional path seems not merely difficult, but utterly futile. For Frobisher, it wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, chilling realization. Honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford. Integrity, a weakness. The rules of the game were rigged, and the only way to win was to discard the rulebook entirely. The very air he breathed was thick with the scent of social injustice and the casual brutality of Elizabethan England. A world where public executions were entertainment, where piracy was a state-sanctioned enterprise, and where the line between legitimate trade and outright plunder blurred into non-existence. Morality wasn't a fixed star. It was a shifting sand dune, constantly reshaped by power and expediency. The wealthy flaunted their excesses, their silks rustling against the rags of the desperate, their overflowing tables casting long shadows over empty stomachs. This stark contrast wasn't just seen, it was felt. It fueled a burning desire not merely to survive, but to dominate. to wrest his pound of flesh from a system he believed had cheated him. He understood early on that appearance was everything, and reality, a malleable concept. To command respect, one had to project power. To achieve wealth, one had to be ruthless. And to outwit the powerful, one had to understand their desires, their vanity, their blind spots. Gold wasn't just a metal, it was a symbol of the ultimate manipulation, the ultimate triumph over a world that had too long denied him his rightful place. His entire life became a performance, a grand deception designed to elevate him above his humble origins. It was a desperate, brilliant, and ultimately terrifying transformation. This profound understanding of human nature, this cynical mastery of illusion, would become the cornerstone of his legend. It would allow him not merely to navigate the treacherous waters of court intrigue and high seas adventure, but to orchestrate them. His greatest triumphs and most audacious deceptions were yet to come, built upon this foundation of early hardship and a chillingly pragmatic view of the world. The salty, furious wind lashed at the rigging, the merciless breath of the North Atlantic. But Frobisher, standing on the pitching deck of his brigantine, the Mary Margaret, felt only the intoxicating surge of absolute control. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the horizon. He wasn't just a sailor, he was a predator, and his world was a jungle where only the most ruthless survived. His reputation, at that nascent stage, was fragile, woven from whispers of desperate raids and a chilling indifference to human life. He needed an iconic act, a declaration of intent, that would echo from Plymouth to Cadiz. The target, a lumbering Spanish merchant ship, laden not just with silver from the New World, but with a far more valuable cargo, the fragile confidence of a self-satisfied empire. Dawn painted the churning waves in shades of crimson and angry red. The Spanish carrack, the Santa Esmeralda, appeared like a specter, its sails billowing, its crew still in the false security of the morning watch. Frobisher gave the command, his voice a low growl cutting through the wind. "Boarding parties, prepare! No quarter for the faint-hearted!" The Mary Margaret surged forward, a hungry wolf pouncing on a fat sheep. Grappling hooks flew, biting into the carrack's timbers with a sickening crunch. Frobisher, moving like a blur, was among the first over the side, his cutlass flashing. The deck erupted into chaos, the clang of steel, the screams of the dying, the acrid scent of gunpowder. He moved with brutal efficiency, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of grim resolve. He wasn't just fighting, he was performing. For his men, for himself, for the legend he was forging. He found the captain, a portly, terrified man cowering in his cabin. Frobisher wasted no words. He took the manifest, the captain's ring, and a small, intricately carved wooden crucifix. But the true prize wasn't the doubloons spilling from the hold, nor the silks or spices. While his men plundered, Frobisher didn't just take. He left a message. He ordered the mainmast of the Santa Esmeralda, systematically, deliberately chopped down, not in a fit of destruction but with cold, surgical precision. Then he ordered the ship's flag, the proud ensign of Spain, nailed to the shattered stump, upside down, a grotesque, defiant insult. And as they sailed away, leaving the crippled carrack to drift, a chilling sight emerged. An impromptu gallows had been erected on the Santa Esmeralda's deck, from which hung not a human figure, but a crude effigy draped in a stolen Spanish uniform. A silent, chilling warning to any who dared cross the path of Frobisher's growing legend. This wasn't mere piracy. It was psychological warfare. The tale of the Santa Esmeralda spread like wildfire. Frobisher wasn't just a successful raider. He was a terrifying force, a man who broke not only ships, but spirits. His name became a curse, whispered in Spanish ports, a rallying cry among English privateers. This audacious act, bordering on pure theatrical villainy, cemented his reputation as a man of extreme daring and utter ruthlessness. It was this reputation, paradoxically, that began to draw the attention of those in power who valued results over propriety. He had proven his mettle, his capacity for decisive, brutal action. He had shown he could take what he wanted and make others pay for his audacity. This early taste of boundless power, the ability to bend reality to his will through sheer force and intimidation, became an intoxicating elixir. setting the stage for his greatest, most audacious deception. He had learned that fear was a far more potent currency than decency, and that the illusion of power could be more valuable than power itself. The Arctic, a desolate, frozen wasteland, a place where the weak saw only death. But Frobisher, his mind a kaleidoscope of ambition and avarice, saw a stage, a vast, untamed canvas for his grandest performance. He wouldn't just find the elusive Northwest Passage. He would unearth a treasure beyond imagination, gold so rich it would eclipse even the riches of the Spanish colonies. The Queen, starved for funds, desperate to assert England's dominance, would be his ultimate mark. He needed a story so convincing, so imbued with the promise of unimaginable wealth, that it would blind even the most cynical courtier. The Black Stone was his prop. The first voyage to Baffin Island, 1576, a small, ill-equipped fleet, testament to his initial struggle for patronage. But Frobisher returned not with a passage, but with a chunk of dark, heavy ore. He presented it, almost reverently, to the royal alchemists, men whose livelihoods depended on finding what others could not. Was it iron pyrite? Was it just common rock? Initial assays were inconclusive, or perhaps conveniently ambiguous. But Frobisher, a master of persuasion, spun a tale of hardship, of discovery, of a land teeming with untold riches. He painted a picture of England not merely prosperous, but golden. The court, hungry for any sign of divine favor, any quick fix for its financial woes, seized upon it. The gold rush was on. The second expedition, 1577. A larger fleet, more men, all consumed by the dream. They brought back 200 tons of black stone, hauled from the frozen earth, a monument to human folly. The assayers, under immense pressure, began to find gold. Or did they? Whispers began, faint at first, then growing louder. Some claimed the assays were rigged, that samples were secretly salted with real gold. Others, desperate to believe, clung to hope. Frobisher, meanwhile, basked in the adulation. He was the golden boy, bringing prosperity. He walked the corridors of power, his every word now gospel. He signed contracts, commissioned ships, commanded hundreds. It wasn't just about money. It was about the feeling of absolute, undeniable power. He was an alchemist of a different sort, transmuting base rock into pure, unadulterated influence. The third expedition, 1578. The scale was staggering. 15 ships, 400 men, a miniature floating city dedicated to mining gold. They brought back 1,350 tons of worthless ore. The docks of Dartford and Bristol groaned under the weight of royal folly. The initial euphoria gave way to nervous tremors. The assays were now undeniably, catastrophically negative. The Black Stone was just rock, a monumental, multi-million-dollar scam. The moment of truth arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating pronouncement from the Royal Mint. No gold, none at all. The illusion crumbled. Panic erupted. Investors were ruined. The royal coffers, already strained, took a crushing blow. But Frobisher, the architect of this grand illusion, faced not the tower, not the gallows, but a reprimand. A stern reprimand. He was stripped of some minor commands, yes, but he kept his ships, his reputation as a formidable seaman. How? Why? He blamed the assayers, the weather, the very nature of the elusive ore. He played the victim, the misunderstood visionary. He had gambled everything, not just on gold, but on the crown's desperate need to believe in him, to believe in the illusion he had so masterfully crafted. His sheer audacity, his unwavering conviction, even in the face of irrefutable evidence, somehow saved him. The Queen herself, having invested so much hope, so much prestige, could not allow her chosen instrument to be a complete fraud. It would reflect too poorly on her own judgment. So a convenient narrative was spun, a brave explorer misled by flawed science, rather than a calculating swindler. This was Frobisher's greatest triumph of manipulation, escaping the consequences of a lie that cost a nation millions. He saw it as vindication, proof of his untouchability. Perhaps it was a fatal miscalculation, leading him to believe he could always outrun the truth. The Arctic gold rush was a spectacular failure, a cautionary tale whispered in London taverns. Yet for Frobisher, it paradoxically cemented his legend. He had failed spectacularly, but he had survived. He had defrauded the most powerful woman in England and still retained her grudging respect, or at least her utility. This experience solidified his conviction that rules were for lesser men, that consequences befell those who lacked his audacious spirit. He had touched the very limits of deception and emerged not unscathed, but strangely emboldened. He had faced financial ruin, public disgrace, and royal displeasure, and yet he stood, still a force to be reckoned with. This immunity, this almost supernatural ability to deflect blame and evade accountability, was perhaps the most dangerous lesson he ever learned. It fed a hubris that would define his later years, a belief that he could bend any reality to his will, a belief he would soon put to the ultimate test. The English Channel, 1588. A cauldron of geopolitical tension, a brewing storm poised to decide the fate of nations. And at its heart, the paradoxical figure of Martin Frobisher, the man who had defrauded the crown, now called upon to save it. With the threat of the invincible Armada, England needed every capable commander. Frobisher, despite recent scandals, was undeniably a seasoned, ruthless seaman, a veteran of countless brutal engagements. His plan wasn't merely to fight, it was to reinvent his image, to wash away the stain of the gold with Spanish blood, to prove his indispensable worth to the very crown he had so recently deceived. This was his chance for ultimate redemption, or ultimate self-preservation. The scale of the Armada was terrifying. 30 ships, 30,000 men, a floating fortress designed to crush England. Frobisher, given command of the Triumph, one of the largest ships in the English fleet, was destined for the thick of the action. He didn't hesitate. While others debated tactics, Frobisher, driven by an almost primal urge to dominate, engaged the enemy with a fury bordering on madness. He knew only one mode: attack. The channel became a maelstrom of cannon fire, splintering wood, and human cries. Frobisher, a towering figure on the Triumph's quarterdeck, bellowed commands, his voice raw, his eyes burning with the fever of battle. He steered his massive ship directly into the Spanish formations, heedless of intricate choreography or strategic retreat. We've already seen how Martin Frobisher, this genius of deception, sold the crown heir wrapped in worthless stones, extracting hundreds of millions from the treasury. But let's be honest, a trick of such magnitude could not have been pulled off alone. Behind every great swindler stands a shadowy army of patrons, allies, and, most importantly, beneficiaries, whose interests merge into a single, murky current. Frobisher was merely the tip of the spear, sharp and ruthless, but the spear itself was wielded by far more powerful figures. Who then were these puppet masters behind the gold fever that gripped Elizabeth's court? Recall the Cathay Company. It didn't emerge from thin air. This wasn't merely a group of naive investors blinded by the glint of fake gold. No, behind it stood pillars of the English elite: Lord Treasurer William Cecil, Baron Burghley, the pragmatic and calculating architect of the Elizabethan state, the omnipotent favorite Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, whose ambitions knew no bounds, and of course Queen Elizabeth I herself. They didn't just believe Frobisher. They wanted to believe. England was on the brink of war with Spain, the treasury was emptying, and the national spirit needed a boost. The idea of inexhaustible gold mines in the Arctic wasn't just a dream. It was a strategic asset, a myth, a tool. Perhaps some of them knew the truth from the start, or at least suspected. But this deception offered England something more than gold. It offered hope, attracted investment, diverted attention from domestic problems, and even served as psychological warfare against Spain, painting a picture of an invincible, wealthy England. Frobisher was their ideal operative, audacious, unscrupulous, with a reputation that was terrifying in itself. He knew how to create myths, and the elite knew how to exploit them. It was a conspiracy, perhaps unspoken, but no less real, between avarice and state necessity. And when the scam collapsed, these very same people, whose hands were deep in Frobisher's dirty money, were the first to turn away from him to save their own reputations. But they didn't forget how useful he had been, and that saved his hide. However, not everyone was willing to dance to the tune of the powerful. In the shadow of this gold rush, in the dusty laboratories of the Royal Mint, worked a man whose fate was twisted by this scam. His name was Thomas Atherton. He wasn't merely an assayer. He was a scholar, a man obsessed with precision and truth, a Cambridge graduate for whom alchemy was not mysticism, but mathematics. Young, ambitious, he believed in the infallibility of science and honesty. When the first samples of Frobisher's stones arrived in London, it was Atherton, as one of the junior assistants, who conducted the initial analyses, and his results were unequivocal. 0 gold. Absolutely none. But this report never reached the Queen in its pristine form. The pressure was immense. Senior assayers, intimidated or bribed, revised his findings, discovering traces of precious metal where none existed. Atherton refused to sign the falsified reports. His career was instantly ruined. He was dismissed, his reputation destroyed, his name tarnished as an incompetent or overzealous young man. He became an outcast in the scientific community, his scholarly works ignored, and he himself was forced to earn a living through menial labor, hiding from the disgrace. But Thomas Atherton did not break. The humiliation and injustice hardened his spirit. He did not seek revenge in the usual sense. He sought truth. He methodically gathered every piece of data, every original sample, every discarded report. He secretly communicated with sailors returning from Arctic expeditions, with laborers crushing the gold ore in Dartford, with merchants ruined by the collapse of the Cathay Company. He became a shadow, the unseen archivist of the century's greatest deception. His vengeance was as cold as the Arctic wind and as precise as his laboratory measurements. He waited for the moment when the masks would fall, when the truth would emerge, and when Frobisher, this arrogant pirate and mystifier, would finally trip over his own lies. Atherton wasn't merely an antagonist. He was the embodiment of the relentless, slow, but inevitable reckoning that always catches up to those who toy with reality. And his time would come. But before his time came, Frobisher was destined for another triumph, one that would only elevate him before his fall. The air in England, thick with the scent of gunpowder and the lingering fear of the Armada, slowly dissipated. Sir Martin Frobisher, the man who had cheated death and the crown, stood on the cusp of legend. He had outsmarted the Queen, defied the Spanish, and escaped the gallows for a fraud that today would bankrupt entire nations. In his own mind, he was invincible. But even the most cunning predator eventually encounters someone he underestimated. Thomas Atherton, the disgraced assayer, wasn't just a wronged scholar. He was the embodiment of relentless retribution. For years, while Frobisher basked in glory, Atherton, ostracized from polite society, slowly, methodically, like a mad clockmaker, gathered every shred of evidence, every refusal, every falsified document, every whisper of doubt in the taverns. All found its way into his dossier, becoming part of an indictment that wasn't spoken in court, but hung in the air, a shadow relentlessly following Frobisher. Frobisher, blinded by his own infallibility, failed to see the storm clouds gathering around him. His elite patrons, the very ones who had cynically exploited the gold myth for their political games, began to turn away. William Cecil, Robert Dudley. They were pragmatists, and Frobisher, having survived the gold scandal and emerged a hero, was becoming an increasingly dangerous asset. His audacity, his untamable nature, his capacity for grand schemes. All that had once been his strength now morphed into his weakness. He was too loud, too prominent, and knew too much. Frobisher's final mistake? Not underestimating an enemy on the battlefield, but underestimating an enemy within the system, and perhaps underestimating death itself. In 1594, as England embroiled itself in another messy war with Spain on the continent, Frobisher was dispatched to France to the siege of Brest. This was no glorious naval battle, but a grueling, bloody land-based meat grinder. He, the sea dog, was thrown into the trenches, like a spent resource. Was this a subtle calculation by the Crown, a way to dispose of an inconvenient figure while saving face? Perhaps. For heroes don't die on the scaffold for fraud. They die on the battlefield. Beneath the walls of Fort Crozon, in a hellish inferno of fire and steel, Frobisher sustained a wound. Not a heroic sword blow, nor a cannonball, but a seemingly mundane arrow or arquebus shot lodged in his thigh. A trifle for such a seasoned warrior. But this trifle became his end. He brushed it aside like a bothersome fly, like all the accusations in his life. Gangrene. A slow, agonizing death that no deception, no audacious lie, could postpone. We can only speculate what ran through his mind in those final, agonizing days, as his body decomposed alive. Perhaps he saw Atherton's face, quiet, triumphant, standing over him. Perhaps he laughed at the irony of fate, to die from a festering wound, not at the hand of the executioner. Perhaps he cursed the queen who had used and discarded him, or more likely, he remained true to himself until the very end, a cynical, unscrupulous pragmatist, aware that in this world, truth doesn't matter, only power and the ability to seize it. His dying words, if recorded, would surely not have been a repentance. Rather, it would have been a final, contemptuous, "I won, I fooled everyone," and not even death can change that. His body was transported to Plymouth, then to London, and buried in St. Giles's Church, without undue honors, without triumph. Not as a hero, but not as a fraud either, simply as a figure who had ceased to be useful. And in this ignominious end, in this quiet grave, lay a much deeper truth about the nature of power, deception, and how easily grandeur can be fabricated, only to be just as easily consigned to the dustbin of history. This truth, much like Frobisher himself, continues to live on, manifesting in the most unexpected forms. Frobisher's death, however agonizing and unseemly, did not mark the end of his story. It merely signaled the beginning of a cycle that repeats again and again, down to the smallest detail. The main lesson of Martin Frobisher is not that he was a great swindler, but that he was a perfect mirror. A mirror reflecting our collective inclination towards self-deception, our craving for quick profit, and our readiness to believe the most absurd tales if they promise us